Let's talk about the evolution of our writing process. Over time, as we write and we develop and we learn, our techniques and our methods, our storycraft is going to change and improve with practice. One of the things that oftentimes shocks folks is I have almost 3 million words worth of stories and content that's written and will never see the light of day. To give you an idea, that's 20 books worth of published content that I've written and I just don't like it. So I've either paused the story indefinitely until I get the time, the interest back, or it's just never going to see the light of day. Over time, as we improve our storycraft, as we improve our ability to talk and tell dialogue, as we practice and we get better at what we're doing, we're going to evolve and improve. Example, I think school has changed a little bit since I was there, but once upon a time when the year started with a one, I was in school as a young person. We were instructed to write a story about leprechauns. I started my story about leprechauns with Dublin, Ireland, a place I had never been. And this was before the internet, so I couldn't look it up. Not easily, at least. I had to physically get a book. My story about my leprechaun started at Dublin, Ireland, and we had to read our stories. That was so bad that I got made fun of because I started my story in Dublin, Ireland, and apparently I was the only one in class who knew where Dublin was. That was pretty much the first kick in the teeth that I took in my story writing and practice. I took substantial break and I got around to it through other avenues, coming back to the storytelling piece. For many years, it was not my primary, but it sounded fun. The first published book was the Guardsman series. That's this one here. They were the first published books. This one up here, The Innkeeper's Niece, was a dare. And this one over here was the first book I started writing, Symbiote. Symbiote was a little bit difficult to write because it was stuff I knew. Symbiote is a modern military science fiction. And I say that because it's modern times, technology that's within easy grasp. It's things that we can do now. It's science fiction because science fiction elements are brought in, as in human technology opens a door and we get to deal with the repercussions of that. Because it is modern military and it was an early story, you have to write what you know. So my little mistake with my Dublin, Ireland leprechaun story, I didn't really know what I was talking about. I was in 6th grade, so obviously nobody knows anything when they're in 6th grade. Symbiote starts with modern military and events in the past that are actual historical events that I've thrown fictional characters into. So while it's not historical fiction, the early settings, particularly the early chapters, are modern military in style and scope. I had recently left the military. That sort of stuff was fresh in my mind. I knew how to write it. I knew what the experiences were. So there was something of a self-insert. The Symbiote series touched entirely too deeply on the self-insert, very close, very personal, because a lot of what I was seeing, a lot of what I was doing, basically by nightmares, were being written into Symbiote. That self-insert, the writing, which there wasn't as much of a separation between the author and the characters. For the most part, there was a separation between the characters within the story, but the self-insert, as I read back over Symbiote, was a little bit too intense. Because Symbiote was modern military and the final several chapters are basically one long, intense battle, the perspectives shift between 4 different parties based upon the experiences of those parties in the hellish modern battlefield. And that was very difficult to write. When you're writing that kind of stuff and you're getting in close, it's like that method acting piece where you have to put yourself into the position of your characters. You have to know and understand and think like them and experience what they're experiencing so that you can put the grit and vitality into the story. And it's very difficult for me to touch. I have to have my nightmares so that I can write the story. Basically, it's like inducing nightmares. I would read the story in editing before I went to sleep. I'd go to sleep, have nightmares about it, but write it the next morning and then repeat the process. So it was like 30 days of brutal combat related nightmares, which was unfun. As we got into the Guardsman series, I enjoyed that much more. Guardsman splits between the main protagonist and the character who got him in trouble. So as you're switching between those two perspectives, it's a male perspective, female perspective, switching between those perspectives was an interesting challenge because what that forced me to do was to put the motivations of someone I am obviously not into play. Additionally, the development of the villain was deliberately taken from all of the worst people I've ever met, taking all of their worst traits and then combining them into one fictional individual who's just a raving jackass. I'm working in a first person perspective. Unless you are physically there, you're not really seeing what's going on. I don't like exposition explaining what the bad guy's doing. It's not until the third book, this one over here, Wrath and Retribution, that I actually switch into the villain's perspective. Prior to, it typically maintains the perspective of the two main characters, and then Blood Debts over here has a number of linkages to the past. It's basically ghosts talking to you. Those chapters are a little difficult to write because to create the characters effectively, you have to care for the characters. I have to care for the characters I'm creating. I can be angry with the characters, but I have to empathize with the characters, which puts an emotional connection with the characters. And because Blood Debts was about a second book in the series, since Blood Debts was pulling on the ghosts of the family, I knew going in that those characters were not going to make it to the end of the chapter. So in the span of a chapter, I had to create an emotional connection with the character, develop the emotional connection with the character, help readers enjoy those characters, and then kill them. Not much fun, but it's also essential because it divorces the personal ego from the character. You have to put yourself into the character to understand the character, but it forces you to have a different character. The character needs to be their own. It was a rapid fire development of multiple characters. The innkeeper's niece was between Blood Debts and Wrath and Retribution. The innkeeper's niece was effectively a dare. The young woman who was teaching me how to publish bet me that I could write a story that would make her blush. I won the bet. When you're writing in the romance genre, it's not necessarily squishy, gooey stuff. The essence of the romance genre is that you need to understand interpersonal relationships and how these two people connect. The innkeeper's niece is guided along a supernatural trail. The connections and conversations that happen are designed to the connection. And the supernatural stuff is sticking its nose into the business and causing trouble. Where the story, that supernatural connection is important because it's the type and the genre of the story it is. But it's the emotional connection between the two characters that's the most important. Because it's more of a romance stuff. As the writing technique developed, it became more essential to practice those other pieces and to include that romance because you have to understand how emotional connections work. Over time and over practice, from the Symbiote, which was this one up here, down to the Guardsman 1, Guardsman 2, Innkeeper's Niece is a Dare, finish Guardsman 2, finish Symbiote, and then finish Wrath and Retribution. Between those, bouncing around in the stories in the series, the techniques and the process of creating the emotional connection with the story changed and improved and evolved. The dialogue I wrote in 2010 is vastly different than how I structure dialogue now. For example, when you're writing a physical book, it is okay to do open quote, text, comma, close quote, so-and-so said. That does not work when your story is narrated, meaning audible, which didn't really get connected until after I started. So considering an audiobook format, you have to describe who is saying what, unless you have two people or multiple people acting out the story. And each character has their own physical voice. If your narrator is just going to read in the same voice, your story is going to come off clunky because it's going to be jarring when the text changes. If you have one person talking and then the next person talking and then the next person talking and the next person talking, but it never tells you who is talking at the beginning of the sentence, you don't know when somebody is changing the narration. And you can tell books that are written for print that are immediately adapted for an audio format, because oftentimes they'll begin and they'll go for 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs worth of chat that sort of sounds like exposition because you don't know who's talking. And then all of a sudden it says, John said. It would have been nice to know who was talking up front. So when I realized that and my dialogue started evolving, I had to rewrite all 3 books in the Guardsman series because I hated how they sounded to my ear. When I took The Honor of the Fallen and I set my voice to it on the recording, on the video that I created, I hated it. It was horrible because I didn't know who the hell was talking because it's just me droning on. So I had to go back and spent about 2 months rewriting every single string of dialogue in the entire 3-book series. It's about 400,000 words for the first 2 books, and then it's another 200 and something thousand words for the third book. 650, 700,000 words I had to go and I had to rewrite of dialogue. That's a phenomenal amount of time, because it's not just changing edits and changing tenses. You have to rewrite the physical paragraph structures. I had to rewrite my books because I hated how I sounded narrating my own book. When you have that experience, it forces you to evolve your dialogue. The evolution of the writing process is stark when you have that kind of issue. So when you're putting your dialogue together, really helps to understand that structure, especially if you're planning to port your text over to an audio format. One of the tools I have learned in the evolution of my writing process is that programs can play your work back to you. I think Microsoft Word has it, and I'm pretty sure that you can get add-ons into Google Docs that will read your material back to you. You can put your text into programs and they will translate it into voice and it will read back to you so you can listen to your text. That's a phenomenal way to edit, because then you hear all the jarring and janky language. You don't necessarily get all of the weird language in a grammar and spelling check. Sometimes things will pass a grammar check because it's grammatically correct. It just sounds stupid. When you're listening to your work read back to you, especially at an accelerated pace, those moments where the text is janky, they're extremely clear. That was another major step in the evolution of my writing process, is listening to my own stuff read back to me, either in my own voice or somebody else's voice. Ultimately, the biggest evolution in the writing process for me has been establishing a better flow for dialogue. Once I started doing better with my dialogue and being more descriptive in the entry to that dialogue, it helped a lot. When you're entering a story, you want the world to feel real. You want the world to smell real. So in the dialogue, as the character is speaking, the dust in character's teeth ground against his lips uncomfortably as he shouted over his shoulder for blah, blah, blah. You can see and feel that, and it puts you into the situation on a visceral level. You've immediately created a connection with the audience, because now you're not just expounding on what the character is doing. You are assisting your reader along in feeling what your character is feeling. Everybody knows what wind-blown dust in the eyes and teeth feels like. But if you're not putting that into your character's description and their world, people may not imagine it, they may not incorporate it. But if you deliberately set that kind of evolved dialogue into play, you readers are going to ultimately find a much better, much more fulfilling experience. Smells are another good one, because if you're describing the city streets of a fantasy world, chances are they're probably not going to be pristine streets unless there's some sort of magical sewage treatment system. A medieval world was really pretty shitty. Everybody was crowded around each other. And historically, it was very difficult to get clean water in a city, which is where you got a lot of the diseases and the dysenteries from, because everybody was pooping and everybody else was drinking water. It really was not until the process of beer making was purifying water for the masses that people really began to be able to industrialize and lift themselves up into larger cities, because it's the clean water in that whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs that's going to be super important. Because if your water supply in your city is contaminated, everybody's going to have a bad month. So when you're setting that description into every single line of dialogue and building your world with your dialogue, it's your characters interacting with the world pressing in on them from whatever direction, knocking the story this way, knocking the story that way. As your characters are interacting between themselves, that's a much more compelling storytelling method that I have found that I am actively engaged in practicing and developing. So that's where I am right now. I started with the new author self-insert. I've written a whole bunch of crap that nobody's ever going to read. I evolved that and I had to figure out how to finish a story that was really uncomfortable for me. I wound up writing 2 whole books. In a different story, I did my fun little storybook dare. Then I finished the story I originally started writing, and then I finished the third book in the Guardsman series. So it was a tangly process, and there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of learning how to publish, how to write dialogue, how to create the emotional connection, how to describe the world, how to storytell, how to run the arc from here to there, how to make the connection from the crappy position our characters are in, run it through the third act, down to the conclusion act, and then full series, beginning, third act, conclusion, and then conclude to beginning, third act, conclusion, running through that whole process with the story as a whole with its story arc, plus with each individual book, beginning, middling, and ending, and then getting into the dialogue and adding the description, adding the feel to the world. That's all pretty important. It has probably been about 15 years that I've been writing books and telling stories, publishing and telling stories. So that's where I'm sitting right now. We'll see where we go in the future. But for right now, most of my efforts are focused on the administration, the business side of putting the books out. Putting the books out is the fun part. And I eagerly look forward to getting back into the creation of books. It's necessary to pay the bills for the creation of the stories and the telling of the stories to make sure that the stories are shared properly. And the best way to do that is have your foundational and business stuff in place first. So maybe that's the final evolution of our story writing processes, figuring out that it's a business. It's not just let's tell a story so that nobody reads it. Have a great week. Hope that helped.